Okay, so we're going to wrap up the lecture from last time. Hang on. And then continue on to today's new material, which will segue directly into it. So here we go. So we were looking within Maniraptoran dinosaurs, and we had looked at basal Maniraptorans, then we had gone through Carinatae, that is the clade of Oviraptorosaurs plus Eumaniraptorans, Oviraptorosaurs and Scansoriopterigids, which may or may not be Oviraptorosaurs. And so we moved to the base of Eumaniraptora, so I'll just start with this slide, although we've already covered it. And within Eumaniraptor, we'll see there's two major divisions, Deinonychosaurs and avialians. So we're going to do Deinonychosaurs first, and then avialians. We've covered these slides, so I'm skipping on ahead. Just a brief reminder of Eumaniraptoran traits. Okay, let's see. And the fact that the relationships among Eumaniraptora remain confused. So, Deinonychosauria. Deinonychosaurs, the Deinonychus clade. It's a group from the Jurassic to the Cretaceous. They're recognized by various mandibular and lacrimal traits that we're not going to cover here. So distinctive features of the mandible and the lacrimal. As I pointed out, the relationships among Eumaniraptorans are confused, so there are alternative traits that might unite any one of these groups with avialians relative to the other two. But something that is shared in common between the two major groups of Deinonychosaurs is the sickle-shaped claw on the retractable pedal digit 2. So here we see it in a Troodontid on the left and a Dromaeosaurid on the right. And those are the two major clades in Deinonychosauria. So a slashing or sickle-shaped claw on a toe which is comparable to the toes of cats. So by retractable, extremely retractable, we mean like a cat's toe. Cats don't walk with their toes against the ground. They pull their claws up, and that keeps them nice and sharp and ready to, tear into your leg, or more importantly for them in the wild, to tear into flesh and to climb up trees and so forth. And in the case of Deinonychosaurs, they only had one claw, typically, that was retractable like this. The other two were more normal theropod-type toes. It also means that Deinonychosaur tracks are super distinctive because they're two-toed tracks. Okay, so there are two major clades, probably, in Deinonychosauria. One of these is called Dromaeosauridae. The most famous representatives of Dromaeosauridae, though, don't include Dromaeosaurus, which is actually poorly known. It includes Deinonychus and its even more famous cousin, Velociraptor. So, in colloquial dinosaur communications, these are the raptor dinosaurs in the strict sense, Velociraptor and its kin. Now, there's no definite definition for raptor in this context, and so some people use it for like any theropod, some people use it for all Deinonychosaurs. It really doesn't matter. I mean, raptor has a connotation in the terms of modern ornithology as well for predatory birds. Now, Dromaeosaurids are, well, almost all predatory. I used to be able to say they're all predatory until the discovery of an early diverging branch, which is not, which are sort of goose mimics. I'll get to them momentarily. However, although they're predatory, Dromaeosaurids are almost never, as far as we know, the apex predators. They're never the top predators in their environment. In the predator guild, that is the assemblage of predators that live together in an environment, they're typically the mid or smaller sized predators. So think jackals and coyotes and things of that nature, not lions or bears or what have you, in terms of the ecological role. And there are several subdivisions of Dromaeosaurids. Now, the most famous sorts, the derived sorts, are the ones that look sort of like this, like Deinonychus here, or Saugon, or Velociraptor. Relatively big predatory forms. But there are many, many types of Dromaeosaurid, and some of them look quite different from each other. In fact, recent work shows how diverse they could be. So on this side over here, we see the skull of the goose-mimic Hulscaraptor superimposed over the skull of a rather typical old-fashioned style Dromaeosaurid, so Ornitholestes, and then that whole image superimposed over the skull of long-snouted, tiny-toothed Ostroraptor. So to give you a sense of a variety of sizes in this clade. So speaking of the goose mimic, here it is, Hulscaraptor. Really blew people's mind when it was first described. Very unlike most Dromaeosaurids, but most analyses have it come out as an early diverging branch of Dromaeosaurid with a rather different lifestyle. So its arms are no longer catching hands to grasp prey. The skull is not for rending meat apart. It's probably eating small aquatic invertebrates, maybe small fish, maybe even plants. And so here we go. Not our typical view of a velociraptor relative, but there it is. Another branch, which seems to be a dromaeosaur branch, at least under most phylogenies, are the Unenlagiinae. Strange name for a strange batch of dromaeosaurs. These guys have long snouts and rather tiny teeth, suggesting that they weren't eating large-sized prey, so prey small compared to their body size. Note the orientation of the arms here. This shows this typical Pentaraptoran trait of the sideways-oriented shoulder joint. One of the first discovered Unenlagiinae, its skull remains undiscovered probably, although there's actually a bird skull from the same formation that might actually be its skull, called Rhahonavis. When it was found, it definitely shows those big quill nodes, and it's quite small as animals go. So it's not much bigger than, say, a crow. And so when initially described, it's thought to be the Madagascar or Malagasy flying raptor. Because it's of about the right size to be a flying animal, and definitely had quite big wing feathers or arm feathers. But it's got a really good slashing claw. Okay, and once again, always does this at least once every lecture, and I don't know why. All right. However, other Unenlagiinae are quite large. So Ostroraptor, you see the skeleton of that, the restored skeleton, in front of Fernando Novas, one of the describers of this dinosaur. What their diet was exactly isn't certain. They don't have cone-shaped teeth as such. It's tempting to think that they're sort of dromaeosaurs, which were mimics of Spinosaurids. But they don't appear to be particularly good at going after fish, but who can say? Interesting creatures. So here's some of what's known of Ostroraptor. Ostroraptor, I should point out, one of the largest dromaeosaurids and one of the largest dinosaurs from this point on. Last lecture, we got giant Therizinosaurus, giant Gigantoraptor. We will not see dinosaurs of that scale again today. Ostroraptor is just about as big as they get. Many other more derived, further up the tree, types of dromaeosaurs have a more typical flesh-eating face with zyphodont teeth. Here's little Microraptor. You can see a 5 centimeter scale, 5 centimeters again, easy to convert. That's 2 inches. Practically. 2.54000 repeating infinitely is the number of centimeters in an inch. Good conversion unit to know. So 5 centimeters, essentially 2 inches, a little guy, hence Microraptor. And in this part of the tree, so Microraptorians and their more specialized and larger cousins have an enhancement of that stiffening of the posterior part of the tail. In this case, there are anterior extensions of the chevrons, remember those kayak-shaped chevrons generally, and of the neural arches that extend multiple vertebral length. And it makes the distal part of the tail relatively stiff. Think of a sort of a fishing rod, still mobile, but relatively stiff compared to something where the individual tail vertebrae move freely relative to each other. Here is one of the best specimens of Ornitholestes found, one of the most complete raptor dinosaurs, dromaeosaurids found in North America. I think it's the most complete ever found in North America. With a good flesh-eating skull. Here's Deinonychus, its larger and earlier cousin. Remember, Deinonychus had a key role in the history of paleontology. I talked about it when I talked about the history of paleontology. This discovery of Deinonychus really set John Ostrom on a couple really important paths of discovery. One, the idea that many dinosaurs may have been very active and dynamic and not slow-moving like was thought for much of the 20th century. And because bone for bone, it is incredibly similar to Archaeopteryx, and this was by far the first complete dromaeosaurid ever found. It revived and modified an older idea that I'll be approaching soon, which is that birds lie within dinosaurs. So it's key to discovering the dinosaurian origin of birds. Deinonychus is almost inevitably shown, both at museums and in art, attacking the big iguanodontian from its environment, well, relatively big, Tenontosaurus. It probably did eat Tenontosaurus, but Tenontosaurus did things other than get eaten by Deinonychus, and Deinonychus would have eaten things other than Tenontosaurus. So. And here is a much more recent and much more likely restoration of Deinonychus than things you've seen before in pop culture. Colors totally unknown, exact feather patterns unknown, but yeah, as feathered an animal as a bald eagle or a red-tailed hawk or a chicken. Of course, Velociraptor, due to the Jurassic Park movies, is the most famous of the dromaeosaurids, a relatively small animal. There again, it's 5 centimeters, 2 inches. Not a big animal. That skull's not much bigger than my hand. But not an animal that you'd want to encounter close up in life. And here is, again, that famous specimen of it fighting a Protoceratops. Now, there were other dromaeosaurs that got quite large. So, Dromaeosaurus itself is somewhere between Velociraptor and Deinonychus in size. And down here we see a Kilobatar, one of the largest forms. Still, well, it's described from halfway decent material, but we'd like to find more of it. It's one of the last really giant dromaeosaurs, so bigger than a human being. One of the very last dromaeosaurs of all is also one of the largest. Here's the Cotoraptor. However, despite the really detailed skeleton that you see, what you see in the upper right corner is what's actually known. So we don't even know its skull shape. For all we know, it might wind up having like an Ostroraptor type skull or something. And at least some of the bones that were found with that specimen are not dromaeosaurid bones. So we're hoping that more will be discovered. There definitely is a giant dromaeosaurid that lived side by side with Tyrannosaurus and Triceratops. Getting more detail about it will be helpful. It's a rare, very rare animal, known from one described specimen and a couple poorly, even smaller and less complete undescribed specimens. Much earlier than that is the largest of the dromaeosaurs we know of, Utahraptor. This is a rather peculiar position for the mount. You see it in front of Michael Pittman, who is another theropod researcher. He actually specializes especially up in these Pentaraptoran forms. And here's a reconstruction of it. Utahraptor will soon be the best described dromaeosaurid due to the fact that a pack of them, from tiny little babies to big adults, was found mired in a very swampy sediment, a quicksand-like sediment. And although they've been somewhat disarticulated, the bones are all there, from tiny little babies to huge adults. And it's just a huge process. It's going to be a decadal-long process for that big block. They took a block, multiple tons of that sediment out, and are going to slowly but surely separate it out. And so we'll have a whole growth series of this dinosaur. But what comes out shows, not surprisingly, what happens with most dinosaurs, their proportions get more robust, more heavily built as they get larger. So, okay, and so that gives you a sense of the size of an adult Utahraptor. And this is the largest dinosaur we'll see from now on, at least with regard to dinosaurian diversity. I mean, there'll be a lecture later on dinosaur size, and we'll definitely see lots of big sauropods, but we're moving up the tree from these guys, and there aren't any animals further up the tree towards modern birds, or within modern birds anywhere near that big. Now, what is that big slashing claw for? Well, initially it was thought to be a slashing claw, but it's not made of steel. And although in smaller forms, slashing can work, anyone who's got a cat can know slashing can be pretty serious. In terms of actual predation, piercing and holding is probably more important. And a paper came out about a decade ago where they referred to the idea of raptor prey restraint, or RIPPER. Yes, they went out of their way to make sure, make sure that it fit an acronym that was appropriate. May have been a primary function, that is to pierce into the flesh of the animal, hold it down while the jaws and the arm claws are used to dispatch the prey. Here's a look of Deinonychus doing that to a, hey, wow, surprise, that's a Dinosaurs. Modern true raptor birds actually do a variation on this. So this is a Galapagos hawk on top of a Galapagos marine iguana, trying to hold it down. Eventually, the iguana does tire out and it kills the iguana. So it's not, this isn't a wholly hypothetical situation. Modern predatory Maniraptorans do use this technique. Okay, the other branch of Deinonychosauria is Troodontidae. Troodontidae tend to be long-legged, and they tend to be relatively short-armed. In fact, notice that in order to make it use its arm to try to capture that little orthopod, they had to orient the body downwards. The earliest forms of troodontids have that opisthal-cubic pelvis, the backwards-pointing pubis, as do Dromaeosaurids, and as do avialians mostly. Most, but not all, of the later ones re-evolved a forward-pointing pubis. Now, early troodontids have zyphodont teeth, have blade-like teeth, as do Dromaeosaurids, well, as most of them. But derived troodontids have phyllodont teeth, although there are a special type of phyllodont teeth that are particularly sharp, so they're probably omnivorous. Also, later forms of troodonts have an arctometatarsus, so yet another independent evolution of this pinched third metatarsal that, as we'll see when we talk about locomotion later on, is associated with higher speed running and or greater agility. Now, troodontids show up in the late Jurassic, rarely, but they're there, and in various points throughout the early Cretaceous, but they're most common in, surprise, surprise, late Cretaceous of Asia and North America. Okay, so here is the oldest known troodontid, although it is, some studies had it come out actually as a early dromaeosaurid, but I think the troodontid model is not bad. From the Morrison Formation, the late Jurassic of North America, little guy Hesperornithoides, and there's a restoration of it. And it's little. I mean, I think this is a 1 centimeter scale down here, and I think that's a 10 centimeter scale. Here's an early Cretaceous one from China, Jinfangopteryx, with all the feathers preserved around it to varying degrees. So that's the reconstruction of Jinfangopteryx, and above it another early form. So they typically were quite small dinosaurs early on, but in the late Cretaceous you began to get some very large ones in Asia and North America. Here's Talos. And the last and largest troodontid, well, not the last, but one of the largest troodontids, Latinovenatrix, the only troodontid which is actually bigger than a human being. All the previously known ones were smaller. Troodonts have a reputation of being the brainiest non-bird dinosaurs. That's not entirely undeserved, but it turns out, some of the Oviraptorosaurs are pretty brainy, and early troodontids were not super brainy, but this radiation of late ones are. You can see sort of the bulging top of the brain case there. Also with little rounded snouts compared to more blade-like snouts or hatchet-shaped snouts. Here's the actual, this is the type specimen of Troodon. It's a tooth. Here's the foot of Deinonychosaurus, or is it Latinovenatrix, or is it Troodon? There's a whole mess there. Here's Latinovenatrix with a kind of backwards pointing pubis. And for reasons of fate, this is the only group of dinosaurs where we have multiple species found in their sleeping position. It just is. In multiple spots in East Asia, we have individuals that are in what were probably their normal resting position, but happen to be buried either by ashfall or sandstorms. And they're both quite little specimens. Cute little Mei here. In fact, its full species name is Mei Long, which is sleeping dragon in Chinese and Mandarin. So there's its skull, there's the neck, there's the back, tail wrapped around the body, legs tucked underneath, and the arms folded up against the side. And in the case of Sinornithoides, we're seeing it from the bottom side. So you can see the feet and then the tail around it. We actually have nests of Troodons. When we talk more about nests later on, we'll talk about Troodon nests and eggs. So that's the muddy part of the nest. And there are eggs that were recovered from, if not that particular nest, other nests nearby. And so here's a restoration of Troodons with their nest. All right, so that's Deinonychosauria for us. This is Microraptor, by the way. And now we're going to move on to the last major clade of dinosaurs, and that is Avialae. So, Avialae, the flying dinosaurs. So what's this term, Avialae? Well, it was introduced in 1986 because of, well, actually, to try to clarify issues about the bird origins. Traditionally, the clade of birds, actually more traditionally, the class of birds is called aves, which is just birds. I mean, that's the Latin word for, plural for birds. Avis, individual, aves, plural. But where does the taxon aves go? Some people use aves as any creature in bird history, but then where do you have it start? And it became very imprecise, as we will see. So, in 1986, with the first big cladistic study of birds and other dinosaurs, Jacques Gaultier proposed this term Avialae, bird wings. And that's the clade of everything closer to modern birds. So aves is restricted to the modern style birds. And Avialae is the clade of everything that's aves and everything closer to aves than to Deinonychus. At the time Gaultier was writing, there were really only 3 well-described members of Avialae other than aves. There were some others that were known, but they weren't well-described. And this we'll encounter them all in this lecture. Part of this lecture may spill on to Friday, but I was planning on that. And these would be Archaeopteryx, Ichthyornis, and Hesperornis. Late Jurassic and 2 late Cretaceous forms. But in the decades since, our knowledge of Mesozoic birds has exploded. It has been the biggest expansion of our knowledge of any group within Dinosauria, and we've had expansion of knowledge in every group of Dinosauria since then. But Avialae, we have greatly expanded our knowledge in there. Vastly more information there. Now, what is the first bird? That is, what is the basalmost and earliest occurring member of Avialae? People really want to know that, as if you know, when you had this first divergence, as if it made a difference. You know, at the time, it wouldn't have made a difference. In many, but not all, recent phylogenies, this animal is the oldest known member of Avialae and the earliest branching. Not Archaeopteryx. We'll get to Archaeopteryx in a bit, and to be fair, for the better part of a century and a half, Archaeopteryx was the best known early member of the bird lineage, probably. But Enantiomnithes is older by a few millions of years. it is known by orders of magnitude more specimens, many of which are more complete than your average Archaeopteryx skeleton, which is saying something because Archaeopteryx has a couple really complete skeletons. It's a long process for these specimens to get described, but they're on their way, and bit by bit we're coming up. So Enchiornis looks like it's probably the basal-most early bird. That was one specimen of it with the feathers well preserved. Here's another one where the feathers aren't preserved, but the skeleton's in really good shape. Now, when initially described, Enchiornis and a couple other taxa that were named from the same formation were first thought to be, okay, they're primitive avialians. No, wait, they're actually primitive troodontids. No, wait, they're primitive non-troodontid deinonychosaurs. No, wait, they're avialians again. They're so close to that point of divergence, it's really hard to tell. And that's awesome, because that means we are very close to what the ancestral form for both deinonychosaurs and birds are. In this course, we're regarding them as basal members of the bird clade of Avialae. And they do share traits with the rest of Avialae that deinonychosaurs don't have. For instance, the nares extends, so the opening in the bone for the nostril region extends posterior to all the premaxillary teeth. We don't see that in deinonychosaurs. They have fewer than 20 dentary teeth. And they've lost the mandibular fenestra. We will see openings in the lower jaw evolve in at least one group of primitive avialian. They're trying to say avialian and not bird. But that seems to be convergent. It does not seem to be homologous to a true mandibular fenestra. So, when we're in this part of the tree, we might say they're birds in a broad sense, but they're really not any more birdy than Dromaeosaurids or Troodontids, at least at first. It takes a while for them to be unquestionably birdy. Avialae begins in the late Jurassic. In the case of Enchiornis, like 2 days after the beginning of the late Jurassic. Okay, very earliest late Jurassic. But they really undergo their major expansion during the Cretaceous. Now, above the level of Enchiornis, we have a couple new derived traits. For instance, the forelimb becomes especially elongate. It's now longer than the hind limb. And we get a reduction in the number of caudal vertebrae, typically less than 22 caudals, and also of the total tail length. So the tail is shortening up in two senses: fewer bones in it, and the total length is shorter. But wait, there are some basal avialians, like Jeholornis here, which actually has a longish tail. So this is much longer than proportionally than any other avialian tail. And there are a few basal Dromaeosaurids whose arms are proportionally as elongate as avialians. So if they were clearly distinctive, we wouldn't have these issues about understanding the relationships. A trait that's sort of recently recognized, though, is that in the case of Avialae, that point actually, that's pointing at the furcula. It should be pointing a little further in, down here. The scapula and the coracoid remained unfused even in adults. In most groups of dinosaurs, when they become a full adult, the scapula and the coracoid fuse to each other. Now, as we'll talk about when we talk about dinosaur growth later on, we have very few fully adult dinosaurs. So your typical specimens that you see don't show that fusion, but on occasion we have representatives of the adults and they're fused. Not so in Avialae. So for a long time, Archaeopteryx was our best model of what the earliest bird was like. And it was, to be fair, it was older than all previously discovered ones. It's from the late Jurassic, from a series of formations in Bavaria, Germany. In fact, this particular type of formation called the lithographic limestone So lithography, you might know, especially if you're in like art, is a type of printing that you do sort of like carving and ink it up on this sort of very fine-grained stone, and then you can print with it. And a lithographic limestone, that's the sort of material lithographers use. It's super, super fine-grained. It's stuff that accumulated on the bottom of a lagoon, and it comes out in perfectly flat sheets because it was totally undisturbed because it was anoxic, without oxygen. As I talked about when we talked about fossil formation, that's a perfect environment for preservation. Low levels of oxygen means that it's not going to be disturbed. And that means fine-grained details will be preserved, including feathers. This is the original specimen associated with Archaeopteryx. It was just an isolated feather. But a feather in the Jurassic was a mind-blowing thing when discovered in the 1850s. Subsequently, many specimens of this genus of dinosaur have been discovered. Archaeopteryx means ancient wing, by the way. And there are several different species we now recognize, one after another after another. This is the most famous specimen, the one that's currently on display at Berlin, and really was critical in the early days of understanding the origin of birds because it was so complete. And it shows things like a bird skull with teeth. So it's got teeth in its jaw. And actually, I should back up here. It has some birdy features, like obviously feathers. In the 1800s, no one thought of any animal other than birds having feathers. It's got a backwards pointing big toe. Well, it turns out it actually doesn't, but it was preserved that way. It's got a backwards pointing pubis, but it has carpals that are separate from the metacarpals. It's got perfectly good claws on its hands, and it has individual caudals all the way out to the tail tip. And those are all things which are not found in modern birds. Several different specimens of them are known, now recognized as being in a couple of different species. They seem to show a general pattern of growth. So the different species are probably not radically different in size. And in the aughts and early teens, it wasn't at all certain that Archaeopteryx was necessarily actually an avialian. So in this paper, Archaeopteryx and other Archaeopteryx specimens wound up being members of Deinonychosauria and not avialians. And here's a later one where they were a series of basal avialians, and we're going to regard them as basal avialians in this class. So, Avialae. Here's a reconstruction of a bunch of Mesozoic avialians. The early branches retain long tails with individual caudals all the way to the end. So Anchiornis, Archaeopteryx, Jeholoornis, Balauer, which may or may not be an avialian. It's from the very latest part of the Cretaceous. It retains many traits that are typical of a primitive Jurassic avialian. However, what was initially described as a kind of Dromaeosaurid, and some analyses have it come out as a Dromaeosaurid. So. But then we begin to shift up to things which clearly show more birdy traits more like modern birds, including a shortening of the tail, a dramatic shortening of the tail. So take a look at this. There we go. So here's Saphiornis. And we get to this clade called Pygostylia. These are these stump-tailed avialians. And they're named after the pygostyle. The pygostyle is the fusion of the posterior caudals into a single unit. And I'll show you good pictures of that coming up. Well, I'll show you pictures at least. Pygostyles are present in all modern birds. Interestingly, they generally start forming post-hatching or near hatching, but all modern clades of birds show it. It turns out that dinocheirid ornithomimosaurs, some therizinosaurs, and some Oviraptorosaurs independently show fusion of the distal caudals or the posterior caudals. But in those cases, it's normally just a couple caudals. In Avialians or Pygostylians, it's a bunch of cottles. Also, Pygostylians are notable for having a tibiotarsus. What's that? That's the fusion of the proximal tarsals, the astragalus and the calcaneum, to the tibia. And if you're unless you're a vegetarian, every one of you has held a tibiotarsus, because that's the drumstick. And the bottom of the drumstick, you see that sort of curved structure. Those are the proximal tarsals, the astragalus and the calcaneum, and they're actually fused to the tibia into a single bone. Pygostylians are known from the Cretaceous onward. So here's Confuciusornis with its gigantic pygostyle. But take a look at the hand. Its hand, still separate bones from each other, big claws. It's a smallish animal, and here's the pygostyle. All these distal cottals fused to each other. Now, Confuciusornis has a toothless beak, but that's totally convergent with modern birds. Because we'll see all the branches between this and modern birds at least start off as being toothed. Some Confuciusornis specimens show these really long tail plumes, but not all of them do, so leading some people to think maybe it's sexual dimorphism, maybe the males have these display ones, which is entirely possible, but the problem is it's difficult to say when you don't find them if they were absent in the living animal or they were simply not preserved. And so here is a tibiotarsus in green in a modern bird. So when we look at basal pygostylians, we look at early dromaeosaurs, we look at early troodontids, they're really not that different from each other. Most of these seem to have likely been scansorial, that means a climbing animal. Animals that live and feed on the ground, but get up into the trees to protect themselves, to roost, to sleep overnight, and so forth. Now, at that point, almost none of them were probably tree nesters. Tree nesting, even in modern birds, is not what's present at the base of modern bird phylogeny. It's a derived trait. But think about squirrels, for instance. They're feeding mostly on the ground, but they go up and hide in the trees. Early members of all these branches are probably mostly omnivores or insectivores. We see some evidence in fish eating or eating of small vertebrates. And then when we think about the big carnivorous dromaeosaurids, like Utahraptor and Velociraptor and so forth, that's a reversal. They have gone back to the old ways. Because the earlier branches of Dromaeosauridae were not flesh eaters. And think about all the branches we had seen prior to that in Enantiomnithes. Oviraptoris, or getting progressively further, Oviraptoris or Theropoda, Alvarezsauria, and before that, Ornithomimosauria. Those were all omnivorous and non-predatory clades or herbivores. So dromaeosaurs being flesh-eating is a reversal. Okay, now, the next clade up above within Pygostylia is called Ornithothoraces. The name means bird chests. And these animals, unquestionably decent flyers. I think at this point it would be perverse not to call them birds by any definition. To exclude these from birds. They are not members of aves, but we don't speak Latin. Aves and birds are not synonyms in English. So, Ornithothoraces, as the name implies, have changes of the wing morphology, as suggests they are better flyers. It has to do mostly with the chest, as we'll see. They're also smaller. The base of the branch of the two different branches of Ornithothoraces are tiny animals, sparrow-sized, not crow-sized like most of the other earlier avialians were, or basal deinonychosaurs. The brains are growing even more than before. I mean, I think you can see even on little protopteryx here. It's very nice swelling of the brain here. The hands begin to fuse into what we call Carpometacarpi. That is, the carpals are fused to the metacarpals, and the metacarpals are fused to each other. And it's at this point that we actually have that actually fully backwards pointing digit 1. So ornithothoraces, bird chests. So what are some of their traits? Here's the Carpometacarpus. So the distal carpals, the semilunate carpal block, basically, fuse to metacarpal 1, 2, and 3, and metacarpals 1, 2, and 3 fuse together. And next time you get a roast chicken or a roast turkey or turkey wings or chicken wings in general, you can investigate this yourself. That's what it is. That's the Carpometacarpus. Here we see, however, the ancestral state for Archaeopteryx. Metacarpal 1, 2, and 3, they're not fused to each other, nor are they fused to the semilunate carpal block. Also, ornithothoraceans have very large, increased bony, that is ossified sterna. The breastbone is really big, and got these projections coming off of it. Why? Because this. The muscles to do this, which, as you might imagine, might be useful if you're flapping. Additionally, ornithothoraceans have feathers special set of feathers coming off the thumb. It's called the alula, which is a fun word to say. And it is a special addition to the modern bird wing, but it first appears here in ornithothoraces. And just to show you what the alula looks like in a modern bird, there is a bald eagle. By changing the position of the alula, that changes the dynamic properties of the wing. And it's sort of equivalent to the flaps on the back of a modern airplane wing. It helps control some of the dynamic properties of the air flowing over it. Now, Ornithothoraces has 2 major branches. Modern birds are off on this branch. We'll get to them second. We're going to first, though, talk about this branch called Enantiomnithes, the opposite birds. Discovered back in the 1980s. They are a Cretaceous group. In fact, the earliest ones are from fairly early in the Cretaceous. The last ones died with the Great Extinction. In the Cretaceous, and especially in the early Cretaceous, they are more common than the clade of modern birds. They lived in a wide variety of habitats, most of the terrestrial habitats and freshwater habitats. Some were seed eaters, some were probably plant eaters, some were fish eaters. We have impressions where some were like poking down to the ground to grab worms. And they had a big size range from little, Protopteryx here and Cynornis, which are about the size of a sparrow, up to forms about the size of an eagle. In the early Cretaceous, the Enantiomnithes, so that's this part of the tree, had many more branches and many more species than the clade that includes modern birds. And ancestrally, Enantiomnithes were toothed, like Pangornis here, but just like with Conchisaurus, there were some that evolved toothlessness, edentulous means without teeth, separate from modern birds. So it's still separate from modern birds' toothlessness. This shouldn't be that big a surprise. We saw other Coelurosaurs lose their teeth. We saw that happen in Oviraptorosauria. We saw it happen in Ornithomimosauria. And then there's the true birds, the Euornithes. This is aves and everything closer to aves than to Enantiomnithes. It's in this group that we unequivocally get a true feather fan. I'll show what that is in a bit. And that's associated with changes in the pygostyle. Also, if you remember last time, I talked about how having long leg feathers was a Eumaniraptoran trait. It's at this point we lose that. Also, and now here's a really peculiar trait, we pick up a tiny predentary bone here. This is totally convergent with the predentary bone of Ornithischians. But it's in the same spot. also, at this point in the tree, we get another set of fusion. You should notice this as a pattern in bird evolution, this fusion of sets of bones. The tarso-metatarsus. This is where the distal tarsals, which are normally little flat-like things, they fuse to the metatarsals, and the metatarsals fuse with each other. Now, unless you come from a culture that eats bird feet, or you just happen to like it anyway, you're unlikely to see this when you're eating as opposed to some of these other traits. Because normally we don't get our feet with our birds when we're eating them. But they're there. Okay, so let's take a look at some of these traits. The predentary bone. So here's the skull of a euornithine. And at the front, and now here's an interpretive line drawing, a predentary bone, a tiny little bone between the left and right dentary. It doesn't allow them to pivot, so it's not functioning like the predentary of a ornithischian. But it's there. Here's a different one called Yanornis. But see, lots of good teeth. The tail fan. So this is the tail of Archaeopteryx, and this is a euornithine. And so a pygostyle, but a tiny little pygostyle. And what happens is there's this bulb of fat around that little pygostyle and then ring muscles around that. And that allows euornithine birds to modify that fan in all sorts of different ways. The tail fan of earlier birds would have been passive. It would have been the shape it is. They couldn't control those feathers, at least probably not very well. If you watch modern birds, they can control that tail fan in all sorts of different shapes. That fat with the ring muscle around it is like one of those stress release balls. You can deform it in any different way, and so that way they can put their tail feathers into all sorts of positions. On Friday, we'll talk about how that's useful in terms of flight. Here's that tarso-metatarsus, the fusion of the distal tarsals and the metatarsals to each other. One nice thing about that is when they're preserved, you get them all together. You don't have to worry about finding only one metatarsal. Next step up, so within euornithes is a group called Carinatae, the keeled ones. And that refers to the keeled sternum. I'll show you pictures with that when we sort of wrap up the carinates. This is a Cretaceous onward group. They're relatively rare in the Cretaceous compared to the Enantiomnithes. Now, most carinates lose the manual ungles. So below this, we had finger claws. Above it, to this point onward, they're rare, but they're still present, even in modern birds. They're rare. Also, in this part of the tree, the pelvic bones fuse to each other, and they fuse to what's called the synsacrum, or we used to call it just the sacrum and other parts of the tree, the synsacrum. All of the sacral vertebrae are fused together. They're also fused to the ilia. The ilia are fused to the pubes and the ischia. So the pelvis comes out as a single unit. And these are modern birds and their closest relatives, like Ichthyornis here. So let's take a look at some of those traits. And I'm going to show you it in the negative. So these are modern birds. These are members of Aves, and yet they actually have some manual ungles. So Struthio, an ostrich, has got it. Watson has it. These are reversals, probably. Because it's only spottily among modern birds that we see them. So here is a synsacrum in green, and the pelvic elements fused to that. Now the keel, the carinate structure. What that allows is to greatly increase the flight muscles. Or if you're thinking about it in terms of tasty, tasty turkey or chicken, the white meat. And a trait I didn't write down, but it's useful to know, just for your knowledge, is this structure and some reorienting of some muscles and bones up here allows both the downwards muscles, which are these ones, and the upwards pulling muscles, which are these ones, to be on this big keel. And that way you can have much more muscles to do both this and this, and this, and this. And I think you can see why this is a useful trait for advanced flying animals. I'm just going to wrap up with Ichthyornis itself. So here's Ichthyornis, long known since the 1870s. Bird, fish bird is the name. It was found in marine deposits. It was a flyer, and it still had perfectly good teeth in its jaws. So here is the recently, finally well-described skull of Ichthyornis. Nice big brain, relatively speaking. Long maxilla with great big teeth, well, for its size. Dentary with teeth, toothless premax. When we come back on Friday, we will wrap up the 2 remaining final branches of Avialae within a group called Ornithurae, and then we'll take a look at bird flight and its origin.